Hello and welcome to Owning the Narrative. I am Bulow. The show will feature the top news of the week, complete with my observations, and even a little bit of sarcasm thrown in. The top news stories will be taken from my morning news briefings that I write on the Rick Bulow New Media blog every weekday morning. If you go on to like what you see, smash that thumbs up button. And now, let's go right into the news. One of the things that schools is teaching now is this thing called critical race theory, which is a part of the 1619 project that the liberals are trying to use to basically slam down what history is teaching. And there were people fighting back. This coming from my good friends over at thedailysignal.com. Says, Mom says school board threatened to sue her for seeking public information on critical race theory and curriculum. This by Virginia Allen. Nicole Solis was surprised to find her name listed on the meeting agenda of her local school board, especially since it said the board was considering taking legal action against her in response to her many requests for public records. The Rhode Island mother of two began filing records requests with the South Kingstown School District several months ago when she learned that teachers were incorporating critical race theory and gender ideology in the curriculum. But she did not expect the school board to talk about suing her. I was shocked, Solis, 37, told the Daily Signal in a recent phone interview. The school board, she said, did not tell me that the requests were a problem. Now the South Kingstown School District is located about 30 miles north of Providence or south of Providence, Rhode Island. Listed filing lawsuit against Nicole Solis to challenge filing of over 168 PRA requests on the school board's June 2nd agenda. You can see that here as topic I. The school board took a portion of the meeting to discuss Solis's many requests under Rhode Island's Access to Public Records Act. Solis requests focus on gaining information about what the school system teaches and students relating to critical race theory and gender ideology. More than 200 APRA requests have been filed by a single individual in just a few weeks alone. Emily Comiskey, board chairwoman at the time, said June 2nd in a formal statement. Comiskey added that fulfilling Solis's request would take more than 300 hours of our district's time and distract from efforts to make our schools more equitable, inclusive, and empowering by eradicating any harmful practices or prejudices for equity and anti-racism teachings. 4 days after the Daily Signal inquired about Solis's concerns, the school district superintendent stepped down June 28 without answering the request for comment. Critical race theory, which has become a major concern of parents and school systems across the nation, incorporates Marxist theories of oppressor versus oppressed. It ultimately defines all history and human interactions as a perpetual racial conflict. As the Daily Signal's Jared Stedman has written, Solis enrolled her oldest child in kindergarten at the South Kingstown School District in March. She then called the principal of the elementary school to schedule a tour and ask a few questions about the curriculum before her daughter starts school in the fall. At the end of the call, Solis asked the principal whether the school, whose name Solis wishes to keep private, taught anything related to critical race theory or gender identity. She said she was told that concepts related to critical race theory and gender ideology are integrated into lessons. Teachers don't call the lessons boys or girls, Solis said the principal told her. They refrained from using gender terminology. Solis said the principal called it a common practice for teachers to use gender-neutral terminology, but she pressed on the principal on where this common practice came from. Solis said the principal told her that she did not know. Solis had also learned that a South Kingstown kindergarten teacher asks 5-year-olds what could have been done differently on the first Thanksgiving in order to build upon a line of thinking about history, the mother wrote in a recent article for Legal Insurrection. Solis told the elementary school principal that she would email her a list of questions because she wasn't receiving the answers that she was looking for over the phone. After she emailed the principal, school leadership asked Solis to submit requests for public records to gain the answers. She began submitting those requests, and the school district was in constant contact with her about costs and other aspects, Solis told the Daily Signal. They would respond either with an estimate, or sometimes they would give me documents for free, she said. The school district may charge a fee of 15 cents per page for copies and or $15 per hour after the first hour for search and or retrieval of documents. According to the South Kingstown Public Schools website, but she wasn't notified about an issue with the number of requests until she learned that the school board, formerly called the South Kingstown School Committee, was considering taking the legal action against her, Solis said. You told me to submit public record requests to answer my questions, Solis told school board members, according to a recording of the June 2nd meeting. I did what you told me, and now you are holding a public meeting to discuss suing me for doing what you told me to do. This meeting was meant to publicly humiliate me, and it didn't work. And you can see the video on that from Legal Insurrection. The school board meeting felt like my show trial, Solis told the Daily Signal. During the meeting, her requests for public records were displayed on a large screen and categorized by type, she said. It felt like they were examining exhibits to turn into evidence against me, she said. The school board ultimately voted unanimously not to file a lawsuit against Solis, agreeing to seek mediation first. Comiskey stepped down 6 days later as chairwoman of the South Kingstown School Committee before announcing her resignation from the board entirely during a meeting on January 22nd. In an impassioned speech, Comiskey said she hopes all the people of South Kingstown realize the damage that's being done every single day, that y'all choose not to try to come together. We are in a dangerous place, and if everybody does not take a deep freaking breath, we're going to be in real trouble, she said. There's another video about pertaining to that. Christy Fish, who was vice chairwoman of the board, resigned from that position following the June 2nd meeting, but remains a board member. Now, neither the South Kingstown School Board nor the school district superintendent, Linda Savastano, responded to the Daily Signal's email request June 24 for a comment on specific issues raised by Solis. Without specifying reasons, Savastano announced her resignation as superintendent June 28, just 4 days after the Daily Signal's inquiry. In a written statement, she said in part, I know this is the best decision for all involved. The school board unanimously approved a separation agreement with the superintendent after just under 2 years, reported The Independent, a local newspaper. Earlier in June, Solis said she paid the school system $300 for different pieces of information, including the emails of a school board member. She said she has received only a portion of the information requested, but what the school sent is useless. I received a completely redacted email, Solis told the Daily Signal in an email Friday. Everything is blacked out except for some spam and advertisements. The school even redacted the dates of emails, so it is impossible for me to know whether these emails are from the time period I requested. After the June 2nd meeting, the school board got in touch with their attorney and asked me to send them a list of, or a prioritized list of which documents covered by the Access to Public Records Act I wanted first, Solis told the Daily Signal in an email June 24. In an effort to be reasonable, she said, I asked them to instead send me a prioritized list of APRAs with deadlines that they can manage. The school board responded by asking for a 60-day extension on responding to her outstanding request for records, Solis said. She rejected the offer, she said, because she considered it not an offer at all. The school board defamed me in a public meeting on June 2nd and then later demanded I wait an extra 60 days for them to respond to my APRA records, Solis told the Daily Signal, adding they made no offer to waive any fees associated with my purchasing the information 60 days late, and they gave me no prioritized list of APRAs. There was nothing in this offer for me after they treated me so deplorably. This is an offer of non-compliance. And it was so unreasonable that I said I was not interested in further negotiation of my civil right to access public information after such deplorable treatment. In early July, Solis says she paid for another $600 worth of information after receiving a $1,000 donation from an anonymous source. Parents should get involved and find out what is being taught to their children, Solis said, because the risk of retaliation is worth your kids. The people who work at schools are just ordinary people like us, and we should never be afraid of them, she said. And that coming from the Daily Signal. This coming from Yahoo.com on critical race theory and how it's causing controversy in K-12 discussions. Here's what parents should know. This coming on January or from June 2nd. It's a long read, so I'll drop some of it in I'll pack the links in the show notes below. Critical race theory, CRT, a methodology that recognizes how systemic racism has shaped American history, is under fire from state leaders and parents for its role in the K-12 educational system. But experts say that misinformation about CRT is what's shaping resistance. Here's what parents should know about this important topic. CRT's history and tenets. The idea popped up in the 1970s with law scholars Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Mary Matsuda, Patricia Williams, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado as a way to reinvigorate the civil rights movement and address microaggressions or subtle forms of racism experienced by black people. According to the 2001 book Critical Race Theory, an introduction by Delgado and James Stefancic, all professors at the University of Alabama. Although notes the book, the theory later fueled breakout movements for Asian American, Latinx, and other groups. Instead of asking her questions like why women of color tenured in law professor positions, why doesn't the law respond to systemic racism? Kenneth Renner, an associate professor of literary education at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, tells Yahoo Life, it is an analytical discipline that looks deeper into data and context. Renner then explains the tenets of critical race theories as follows. Racism has always existed. People of color are experts in their own experiences and their stories should be told. Intersectionality matters. The law should analyze broader systems of race, class, and gender. White people benefit from racism whether or not they are conscious of it. And it says here that critical race does not mean that all white people are racist, underscores the hashtag Truth Be Told campaign by African American Policy Forum, founded by Crenshaw. Instead, it provides framework and tools to engage government, systems, and individuals about how policies and practices work to disadvantage and harm racially marginalized populations. States the organization, for instance, applying a critical race lens to the issue of mandatory minimum prison sentences, helps us focus on the over-policing of black youth, making them more likely to be searched, arrested, and tried for minor offenses. Now, the article is a little long, so I'll leave it in the show notes down below if you want to read it. But yeah, I mean, critical race theory is just one of the main problems going on in America today. Another major issue is Common Core math, among other things, but critical race theory basically, according to the National Review, is gaslighting parents by the NEA. Reading, Writing, and Racism, the NEA's Campaign to Gaslight Parents, is by Jessica Anderson. 2021 is shaping up to be the year of one of the largest grassroots movements since the Tea Party movement in 2009. Millions of parents across the country are fighting back against the spread of critical race theory in their schools, recognizing it as a dangerous ideological movement meant to divide Americans. The movement is so widespread that CRT was Googled more in June than Joe Biden. Now, understandably, parents are upset that some teachers are telling white students that they're perpetuating racism, while telling black children that they are locked out of the American dream. While the left pretends that this racist ideology is not being taught in grade school, new business items adopted by the National Education Association, the nation's largest teachers union, show that there is a coordinated effort by the education establishment to force leaders or teachers to promote CRT in the classroom and to work to destroy its critics. Let's rewind to last year when parents participating in their children's at-home learning received a front row seat in their children's classrooms for the first time. What they saw disturbed them. Instead of trying to improve America's failing grades on math and science, schools spend class time indoctrinating kindergartners, teaching 5-year-olds about racist police and telling students that all white people play a part in perpetuating systemic racism. That was a spark for a nationwide movement to reject racist, neo-Marxist teaching that spread like wildfire. Parents in places such as Loudoun County, Virginia, are rightly outraged that their children are being taught the racist ideology of CRT. They are heading to school board meetings and state houses to reject CRT and keep it out of their children's classrooms. Thousands of parents have used Heritage Action CRT ebook to understand what CRT is, identified in their community schools, and issue FOIA requests about how to expose how school administrators are promoting CRT. Their activism is working. This year, over 20 states have passed or proposed laws preventing CRT and other racially based ideologies from being forced into our schools. As the nationwide movement reached critical mass, the left scrambled to defend their extreme or widely unpopular ideology. So CRT supporters brought in the big guns. The National Education Association, at their annual conference last weekend, the nation's largest teachers union announced a six-figure campaign to have a team of staffers for members who want to learn more and fight back against anti-CRT rhetoric, and an official position that in teaching these topics, it's reasonable and appropriate for curriculum to be informed by academic frameworks for understanding and interpreting the impact of the past on current society, including critical race theory emphasizers. The announcement exposed the source of CRT in books, not necessarily individual teachers, but a coordinated left-wing campaign that includes massive teachers' unions. I'll leave more in the show notes below if you want to read further, but yeah, so they're bringing out the National Education Association, and we all know how that union is based on what we've seen in the past with Common Core. And okay, I graduated from high school in 1993, and I said it many times. In fact, you may have even heard me say it in past Week in Review videos, but okay, if what people are being taught in schools today was being taught when I was in high school between 89 and 93, I would not have graduated high school. Granted, my grades were poor anyway. Graduating with barely a C, but that's beside the point. This is something that definitely needs to be spoken about, and CRT and Common Core both need to be exposed and given from the school system. And there's this article from NBC News on it. Critical race theory battles are driving frustrated, exhausted educators out of their jobs. Battles over diversity and equity initiatives in public schools have resulted in administrators and teachers being fired or resigning over discussions about race. This by Tyler Kincaid. When Rydell Harrison started a new job as a school superintendent in southwestern Connecticut last August, he was excited to join a community that seemed committed to diversity and equity. The Easton, Reading, and Region 9 district, which covers two small, mostly white towns, had recently established a task force and allocated money to address the racial climate in schools. That decision was a response to the hundreds of students and recent alumni who wrote to school board members following George Floyd's murder to describe racist incidents that they had witnessed or experienced at school. To Harrison, the task force was a sign that the community had sat up and listened when white people advocated for change. Things shifted, however, after the riot at the U.S. Capitol in January. Some local residents started to complain that the diversity efforts were Harrison's agenda rather than something students and alumni requested. They labeled Harrison the district's first black superintendent and activist pushing to indoctrinate students with critical race theory. School board meetings filled with opponents lasted late into the night. A mailer sent to community members from Nonpartisan Action for a Better Reading, a conservative nonprofit group, featured a Facebook post that Harrison had written condemning conspiracy theories that fueled the Capitol riot, and it urged people to complain to school board members about him. Other mailers came from a political group called Save Our Schools, run by two Easton residents who no longer have children in the district, and questioned whether the district had a problem with bias and discrimination at all. Harrison began to doubt whether he could lead the community on its diversity efforts in the face of so much opposition. At the end of June, he announced he would resign. People have asked me, was it one failure too many? And it wasn't just this one thing, Harrison said. It was a collection of all these pieces and the emotional and personal toll to be a black man doing this work and facing very blatant attacks left and right. Harrison is one of a small but growing number of educators who have left their jobs after school districts became inundated in recent months by furious parents who have accused them of teaching critical race theory, an academic framework usually taught in graduate schools that posits racial discrimination as embedded within U.S. laws and policies. Administrators at virtually every district facing these conflicts, including Harrison's, have insisted that they don't teach critical race theory, but conservative activists are using that label for a range of diversity and equity initiatives that they consider too progressive, prompting lawmakers in 22 states to impose limits on how schools can talk about racial issues. And there's more to this, which you can see, which you can read in the show notes down below. But yeah, I mean, critical race theory is one of the big booms and bugaboos being talked about. I'll be bringing I will definitely be bringing this up more tomorrow, as there are a couple of more things on this. But yeah, leave a comment down below what you think about critical race theory. Do you think it should be in schools? Do you think it should not be in schools? Do you pretty much agree with it? If you have children in schools, do you think they should be exposed to it? Leave a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next video. I live about 200-300 miles away from Havana, Cuba, due south of me. It's 90 miles from Havana to Key West, and yesterday there were thousands of Cubans demanding an end to dictatorship. This coming from a good friend, Mary Chastain, over at Legal Insurrection. Down with communism, thousands of Cubans demand end to dictatorship. Biden admin thinks Cubans only protested over COVID cases and deaths. They want COVID vaccines, yes, but they also want to eat and have freedom from the brutal regime. First up, if you need to know anything about Cuba, please follow my friend Frances Martel. Her family comes from Cuba. She is an expert. Cubans marched in Havana against the communist regime, demanding more food and access to COVID-19 vaccines. They also protested against the high rate prices during the pandemic. This from the Miami Herald. From the Malecon, Havana's famous seawall near the old city, to small towns in Artemisa province and Palma Soriano, the second largest city in Santiago de Cuba province. Videos live streamed on Facebook show thousands of people walking and riding bikes and motorcycles along streets while chanting freedom, down with Cuba, and Patria y Vida, homeland and life, which has become a battle cry among activists after a revival music video turned the revolutionary slogan "Homeland or Death" on its head. "We are not afraid," chanted Samantha Regalado as she recorded thousands and hundreds of people walking along a narrow street in Palma Soriano. During the day, protests erupted in several cities, including the island's biggest, Havana, Santiago, Santa Clara, Matanzas, Cienfuegos, and Holguin, but also in smaller towns like Palma Soriano, Cadenas, Colon, Guerra de Malena, Artemisa, and others. In Ontario, a website specializing in Cuban data tracked at least 25 protests in different locations throughout the island. President Joe Biden's administration claims that the Cubans protested strictly over COVID-19. Julie Chen, White House Assistant Secretary, tweeted out peaceful protests going in Cuba as the Cuban people exercise their right to peaceful assembly to express concern about rising COVID cases, deaths, and medicine shortages. We commend the numerous efforts of the Cuban people mobilizing donations to help neighbors in need. The protesters wanted access to COVID-19 vaccines. They also want to end the Bulow regime, eat and have freedom. The communist regime does not recognize a person's natural-born rights. They cannot protest or assemble peacefully in Cuba. Francis Martel tweeted out that the protesters shouted death that were down with Cuban leader Miguel Diaz-Canel. Francis wants everyone to remember how newcomers to the Cuban cause. Diaz-Canel doesn't run anything. The true bosses of the Castro family and Xi Jinping. Yelling Diaz-Canel Singao is useless and annoying. If you're not condemning the whole enterprise of socialism and communism, then you're not on our side. Surprisingly, Diaz-Canel blamed America. In an impromptu televised address later in the afternoon, Diaz-Canel blamed the protests on U.S. efforts to tighten the embargo with the alleged intention to provoke a social uprising that would justify a military intervention. We're not going to hand the sovereignty or the independence of the people. He said there are many revolutionaries in this country who were willing to give our lives. We are willing to do anything, and we will be in the streets fighting. Sunday's protests are not the first time Cubans rose up against the communist regime. And it said that it happened, that the last time happened in 1994, and protests happened in the early 60s. And there are a lot of tweets. I won't get into reading all of them now, but you can read them in the show notes down below. There's also this from National Review: How the U.S. Can Help Cuba Protesters. Critic Chambers, and this by the editors of National Review. Critic Chambers wrote that every communist has accepted the fact that terror is an instrument of policy. Right if the vision is right, justified by history, and joined by the balance of forces in the social wars of this century. He has also said that every communist has heard the screams brought about by their consequentialist modus operandi. In Cuba since Sunday, those screams have been drowned out by the voices of brave men and women, tired of the terror inflicted by the butchers who call themselves liberators, inspired to not just drown out the screams of their mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons, but to bring about their permanent end. The protests spread spontaneously around the country. They were notably leaderless. Most opposition leaders are in jail or in exile. Nonviolent and large, this sort of mass action in Cuba is unheard of and clearly caught the government by surprise. One thing remotely comparable were the mouth-soaked demonstrations in 1994, although they were very localized in Cuba or in Havana and quickly put down. Though tens of thousands of Cubans fled to the U.S. in rafts. The incredibly courageous ladies in white, wives and female relatives of the jailed and disappeared, have constantly protested over the years, but they numbered in the dozens. Predictably, the communist regime has tried to blame the United States for instigating the uprising. Absurd propaganda that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken feebly dismissed as a grievous mistake. A more common explanation in the press of the explosion of protests was that people were angry at the government's COVID-19 response. That response has indeed been sorely lacking given the dilapidated state of the country, but the demonstrations in the street were about much more than that. And there's a video, and you can read the article down below in the comment or in the show notes. But yeah, I mean, I say good on Cuba for were good on the Cuban people, rather, for sticking up and protesting the communist regime. You know, it's about time somebody does something with that. I have a good friend, Valerie Santiago, who has been following all of the protests in the past, and hopefully I might give her a call sometime and find out just what's happening with all this, and or if she's even following it. But now, okay. President Biden had called remarkable Cuba protests a call for freedom, and basically, as was mentioned in Legal Insurrection and National Review, that the people were angry at the government's COVID-19 response. However, former President Trump has a different take on it. This coming from my good friends over at the Daily Caller. They are not afraid. Trump shows support for Cuban protesters. By Ashley Carnahan. Former President Donald Trump showed his support for Cuban protesters, saying in a Monday statement, "They are not afraid." Big demonstrations are breaking out in Cuba and Miami in protest of the communist Cuban government. Although today there are zero protesters in Cuba, you know what that means, Trump wrote. Trump comment on Cuba, and there's a link to it from Cam TV. The 45th president added that he stands with the Cuban people 100% in their fight for freedom. The government must let them speak and be free. Joe Biden must stand up to the communist regime, or history will remember. The Cuban people deserve freedom and human rights. They are not afraid. Trump went after former President Barack Obama as well, as saying Obama attended baseball games with Castros while they imprisoned, beat, and killed Cuban people. Obama sat next to communist dictator Raul Castro at the MLB exhibition game in Cuba, held between the Cuban national team and the Tampa Bay Rays. He also claimed President Joe Biden and the Democrats had campaigned on reversing his very tough stance on Cuba. Thousands of protesters marched through Cuba on Sunday, voicing their frustration against the country's communist regime and at their lack of basic needs. Cubans were in over 32 cities reportedly protested, chanting "Freedom down with communism" and "Patria y Vida." The Daily Caller tweeted out, Cuban protesters outside of the Communist Party headquarters chant, "Cuba isn't yours." And it says Julie Chung, acting assistant secretary for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Western Affairs, claimed the protests are a response to COVID-19 cases and deaths. Despite the cries of freedom, Cuban citizens previously accused the Communist Party of cutting their internet access and preventing them from leaving their homes during the Cuban Communist Party Congress's 4-day session in April, according to Reuters. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel reportedly blamed the protests on the U.S. He claimed that the U.S. purposely limited Cuba's access to essential goods to provoke a social uprising in order to justify military intervention, the Miami Herald reported. And of course, there's this from the AP. Amir Madani and Jonathan Lemire says Biden calls remarkable Cuba protests a call for freedom. President Joe Biden on Monday called protests in Cuba remarkable and a clarion call for freedom, praising thousands of Cubans who took the streets to protest food shortages and high prices amid the coronavirus pandemic, one of the island's biggest anti-government demonstrations in recent memory. The Cuban protest, with the Cuban people are demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long time, if quite frankly ever, Biden said in a brief exchange with reporters at the start of a meeting with mayors and law enforcement officials to discuss gun violence in the U.S. The comments noted a notable change with the comments marked a notable change in tone from Biden's old boss, Barack Obama, who as president sought to ease decades of tension between Washington and Havana while loosening U.S.-imposed economic sanctions. It was an effort that was reversed by Republican President Donald Trump, who partially rolled back Obama's rapprochement. limiting U.S. travel to the island, banning American financial transactions with dozens of enterprises, and more. We stand with the Cuban people in their clarion call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from the decades of oppression and economic suffering to which they have been subjected by Cuba's authoritarian regime. Biden said in an earlier statement Monday, the Cuban people are bravely asserting fundamental and universal rights. White House Press Secretary John Psaki on Monday sought to frame the protests being driven by a far broader frustration, calling the demonstrations spontaneous expressions of people who are exhausted with the Cuban government's economic mismanagement and repression. Psaki added that the U.S. remains ready to assist Cuba in its COVID-19 vaccination effort, but the Cuban government's decision not to participate in COVAX, a worldwide initiative aimed at distributing vaccines to poor nations, complicated the efforts. The scene of demonstrators on Havana's Malecon Promenade and elsewhere on the island was an unusual scene, as the communist leadership has historically shown little tolerance for criticism. Police initially trailed behind as protesters chanted "Freedom, enough and unite." One motorcyclist pulled out a U.S. flag, but it was snatched from him by others. And it goes on to say that Senator Marco Rubio lashed out at Biden, for taking a full day to acknowledge the protesters, noting that Biden's statement did not describe the Cuban government as socialist and communist. Rubio said the protests in Cuba began over 24 hours ago and you forgot something. And Rubio, in a letter Monday, called on the president to take a series of steps in support of the protesters, including making free satellite internet access available on the island, rallying Western Hemisphere and European leaders to condemn the Cuban government's efforts to stifle the voice of protesters, and making a clear and unambiguous statement that the current U.S. policies toward the regime implemented by the Trump administration will remain in place. And yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I might unpack it during the week and see what all is going to come out is. I think there will be a lot coming out with this, but leave a comment down in the comment section below. What do you think about Cuba, about the protests in Cuba? Do you support it? Do you not support it? What do you think about Trump's comments versus Biden's comments? Leave the comments down below. I have the articles in the show notes below, and I'll see you in the next video. With the Cuban crisis that started on Sunday, there are many other articles that are with this. I found this from my good friends over at the Daily Signal about a Cuban dissident who hopes to see the end of the Castro tyranny. This by Fred Lucas. This Cuban dissident hopes to see the end of Castro tyranny. Antonio Varela said he has lost count of how many times he was arrested in Cuba. The human rights activist in 2010 founded Estado de SATS in Cuba, a forum calling for political and economic reform in his home country. Odysee, who is now visiting Florida and lives in Cuba, says he is watching the new demonstrations there with both hope and concern. A priest was brutally arrested and he is now in prison. They, meaning the regime, don't have limits, Odysee said, adding that the priest was beaten by authorities, that the priest beaten by authorities is a close friend. The priest was just walking with the rest of the protesters, and he was just watching what was happening. Odysee told the Daily Signal in a phone interview, the police stopped people and they brutally repressed the crowd. He was trying to stop these actions and trying to protect the people, and they beat him, and now he is in jail. Estado de SATS, or State of SATS in English, is made up of artists, writers, intellectuals, and professionals. The word SATS is a Scandinavian term referring to the movement preceding a theatrical action or sports performance, or a moment of great concentration before a major occurrence, in this case meaning a major change in Cuba. And there is more to this article, including what happened, including Fidel Castro seizing power in Cuba on January 1, 1959, and handed the control of the communist government to his brother Raul, and then handing it to Miguel Diaz-Canel, who is considered a figurehead as Castro continues to make major government decisions. And there's also this from Victoria Taft of PJ Media. Cubans swim streets to demand our freedom and Libertad, but Biden administration claims they really want COVID shots. It gets dumber from there. Thousands of Cubans are marching for Libertad on the streets of Havana, but the Biden administration is working overtime to reframe the calls for freedom as calls for COVID shots. The Biden State Department apparently has been taking its cues from the New York Times, which claimed that Cubans were shouting freedom and other anti-government slogans. But administration officials are taking it even further and dumber. Acting Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs tried putting that on a business card. Julie Chung chimed in with a tweet about how Cubans are taking to the streets in peaceful protests, while exercising their right to peaceful assembly over COVID. And there were a couple of tweets from Julie Chung. It's hard to know where to begin, but that lady with the "you shall" on her business card apparently doesn't realize that swarms of people around the streets are, in fact, there because they don't have a First Amendment right to peaceful assembly and redress street grievances. Cuba doesn't have a First Amendment because it's run by tyrannical commies who don't like the free exchange of ideas. Like Facebook, Google, Canada, the left, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. And there's a First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's adorable that the grown-up woman who works for the State Department doesn't know that. Not only does she get the country wrong, but she also gets the words wrong. Julie is peaceably assembled. Considering that protesters are overturning police cars while yelling down on communism, and the regime's police are beating the protesters, neither appears to apply either. And addressing grievances is out. Jefe is busy, and it goes on that, and the article goes on to say that the Miami Herald reports that the COVID response is on the list of grievances that current dictator Miguel Diaz-Canel does not want to hear about, but it's not the chief one by protesters, as they're also calling for an end to the decades-old dictatorship and demanding food and vaccines, and they're chanting freedom down with communism and homeland and life. Now, Biden stayed quiet about the upsetting or about the unrest in Cuba over the weekend. On Monday, he issued a statement calling on the communist regime to hear the people's voices screaming for freedom and relief from, wait for it, COVID. And yeah, so as I had mentioned yesterday, I mean, everything is all wonky and crazy as far as Biden's reaction to what's happening in Cuba as opposed to former President Trump's reactions. And I mean, it'll be interesting to see just what happens, and if this coup down in Cuba will be akin to the same one that overthrew the Communist Party in the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and the other republics in Eastern Europe, Western Asia in the 1990s. And there's this article from the Washington Free Bacon. It's entitled Cuban regime's biggest defenders in Congress selling on pro-democracy protests. By Jack Baver. Democrats who rallied were behind the Castro regime are selling on growing pro-democracy demonstrations that have gripped Cuba. Thousands of anti-regime protesters took to the streets across the island over the weekend, waving American flags and chanting freedom as well as anti-government slogans. Democrat Representatives Bobby Rush of Illinois, Steve Cohen of Tennessee, Beverly of California, and Gwen Moore of Wisconsin demanded that President Joe Biden lift Trump's sanctions against the Castro regime in a march letter signed by more than 70 members of Congress, including all 4 members of the far-left squad. None of the letter's 4 authors are members of the squad. They weighed in on the pro-democracy protests in Cuba. Rush, Cohen, Lee, and Moore did not return requests for comment. Republican Congressman Mark Green of Tennessee, the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee for the Western Hemisphere, pilloried the lawmakers in a statement given to the Washington Free Beacon. The communist dictatorship in Cuba has been oppressing the Cuban people for decades, Green said. It's absurd to think that any sitting U.S. lawmaker who enjoys the freedoms of our country would ever support a communist dictatorship in another country, especially one as corrupt as the Cuban dictatorship. A Biden administration spokeswoman falsely ascribed the reason for the protest to concern about rising COVID cases, deaths, and medicine shortages, rather than political oppression. The White House walked back those remarks and condemned the regime after critics like Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas called the statement pathetically weak. Biden has a history of taking a lax approach during the Cuban regime. During the Obama administration, the White House lifted restrictions on travel and commerce with Cuba. Support for relaxed Cuban relations extend beyond the administration and House of Representatives. Democrat Senators Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota and Patrick Leahy of Vermont, and Republican Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas introduced a measure in May to lift the embargo on the communist regime. Klobuchar and Leahy brought a similar measure to the floor in 2019. David Carroll, a spokesman for Leahy, told the Free Beacon that the Vermont senator continues to support an end to the embargo and will make a statement about the unrest in Cuba in the next couple of days. Klobuchar and Moran did not return requests for comment, and a review of their communications platforms shows no public statements in support of dissidents in Cuba. Lawmakers of Cuban descent welcomed the protesters and praised their bravery. Democrat Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, called the demonstrations historic, adding that U.S. lawmakers should support their demands by ensuring that we do not perpetuate the regime's decades of repression. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida, said the protests demonstrate the failures of a socialist government. Protests in Cuba aren't simply about shortages, Rubio tweeted. Socialism promises guaranteed food, medicine, and income if you give up your freedom. But as always, it fails to deliver. You don't get your freedom back. That's why the protesters are chanting Libertad. Observers say the island-wide unrest is the largest since the Castro regime took power in 1959. I definitely support Rubio in what he said, and I mean, it's amazing just how the Democrats think one thing, but in actuality something else is happening. I say this part for the course for those on the far left. And there's this article from thehill.com by Rebecca Beach, or Beach. It's entitled Cuban President Blames Unrest on Economic Asphyxiation by the U.S. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel criticized U.S. politics of economic asphyxiation toward the island nation in a Monday speech following protests against the government across the country. It is now very hypocritical and cynical that you block me and you want to present yourselves as a big savior, Diaz-Canel said, according to Reuters. lift the blockade, and then we will see what this people that has achieved an immense social work despite what is practically a war economy is capable of. Protesters have taken to the streets in several cities over lack of food, power, and medicine in the country of 11 million people. The protests were particularly noteworthy given the history in Cuba of generally quashing protests against the government. The U.S. has kept an embargo in place against Cuba in some capacity since 1958, expanding it once Fidel Castro took over. Certain travel and trade policies toward Cuba were eased during the Obama administration, but former President Trump reimposed restrictions. Diaz-Canel also serves as the first secretary of Cuba's Communist Party, taking over a role that previously had been filled by only Fidel Castro and his brother Raul Castro, who was bothered by the regime, the alleged regime in Cuba, who was bothered by the Cuban political system, the way we do things, not our people, not the majority of our people, because they are the ones who have built that system, Diaz-Canel said. Who is bothered? The government of the United States, because they don't see the virtues of this system of government in Cuba that is capable of working with all and working for all, he added. A number of U.S. politicians lent their support to Cuban protesters Monday, with President Biden saying that they were bravely asserting fundamental and universal rights. We stand with the Cuban people and their clarion call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from the decades of repression and economic suffering to which they have been subjected by Cuba's authoritarian regime, he said in a statement. Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, however, seemingly backed Diaz-Canel's position, saying at a press conference that the truth is that if one wanted to help Cuba, the first thing that should be done is to suspend the blockade of Cuba, as the majority of countries in the world are asking. Now that I don't agree with for the simple reason that we've seen how socialism and communism, and yes, they're both communism leads to socialism, or socialism leads to communism and vice versa. We saw how that had affected the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, and that's what the Cold War was fought over. So I'm definitely keeping an eye out on what's happening in Cuba, especially considering as how Cuba is about 90 miles south of Key West, Florida, and I'm about 200 miles or so north of Key West. So, I mean, this is happening right in my own backyard. So, I'm keeping an eye on it. Leave a comment down below what you think about what's happening in Cuba. Also let me know in the comments below what should be done. I'll leave I will leave links to the articles that I've read in the show notes below, and I'll see you in the next video. As the protests in Cuba continue, we're seeing the Obama legacy going up in smoke or in shambles. We have this from my good friends over at the Washington Free Bacon. Says Obama-Rhodes legacy in shambles as Cubans march against communism. Foreign policy guru attended Fidel Castro's funeral in 2016. This by Andrew Stiles. Anti-communist protests in Cuba are threatening to dismantle one of the last vestiges of former President Barack Obama's diplomatic legacy. The unrest has come as a shock to journalists and other Democrats who cheer the Obama administration's efforts to normalize U.S. relations with the communist regime. The controversial initiative, was spearheaded by failed novelist Ben Rhodes, culminated in 2016 with Obama's visit to Havana, where he attended a baseball game with Cuban dictator Raul Castro. The New York Times report on the Cuban protests opens with the following oddly worded passages. Shouting freedom and other anti-government slogans, thousands of Cubans took to the streets in cities around the country on Sunday to protest food and medicine shortages and a remarkable eruption of discontent not seen in nearly 30 years. The COVID-19 pandemic is ravaging the island nation, whose universal healthcare program has been praised effusively in the pages of the New York Times. Acting Assistant Secretary of State Julie Hung, one of the only Biden administration officials to comment over the weekend, applauded the Cuban people for exercising their right to peaceful assembly, a right that Cuban citizens do not actually enjoy under the repressive communist dictatorship. Rhodes acknowledged this fact in 2016 during a press conference in Cuba where he defended the communist regime's detention of political prisoners. It's their belief that they are not political prisoners, that they are in prison for various crimes and offenses against Cuban law, Rhodes said. So intense was Rhodes' passion for the cause of Cuban communism that he attended Fidel Castro's memorial service in December of 2016 and mourned the late dictator alongside official delegations from China, Iran, and Russia, among other prominent human rights abusers. Rhodes eloquently captured the liberal affinity with Cuba as poverty-chic tourist destination in his 2016 or 2018 memoir, The World as It Is. Most of the furniture in the impoverished nation, he wrote, went out of style so long ago that it'd be trendy in Brooklyn. Over the weekend, Cuban dictator Miguel Diaz-Canel delivered a national televised address in which he blamed the country's economic misery on the United States and threatened violence against protesters. The order to combat has been given, he said. Revolutionaries need to be on the streets. In addition to the normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations, Rhodes shepherded the Obama administration's negotiations with Iran that resulted in a controversial nuclear deal. Former President Donald Trump effectively reversed both of those so-called accomplishments, once viewed as Obama's signature foreign policy achievements. President Joe Biden has expressed his determination to re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement, which he championed as vice president. The odds of that happening anytime soon appears increasingly slim, however, following the election of President-elect Ibrahim Raisi, a hardline Islamist already sanctioned by the United States for his role in the mass execution of political prisoners. Biden may ultimately decide that Obama's foreign policy legacy is not worth reviving. Generally speaking, the Obama-Rhodes brain trust succeeded only in unleashing chaos upon the world. The military withdrawal from Iraq, chaos, followed by the rise of ISIS. The military intervention in Libya in 2011, chaos, followed by the assassination of a U.S. ambassador. The refusal to intervene in Syria after President Bashar al-Assad crossed Obama's red line. Chaos, followed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Rhodes continues to be lauded and respected by journalists as one of the country's most knowledgeable foreign policy experts. I just have to laugh at that and say, let's move on. We have this from the Conservative Daily News and Eric Wright. What can America learn from Cuba? Well, it appears that Cubans have had enough of communism. According to reports, thousands of Cubans took to the streets on Sunday to protest the lack of food and medicine. According to liberal CNN, the country suffers from a grave economic crisis aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic and U.S. sanctions. Demonstrators complain about a lack of freedom and a worsening financial situation. Is this a precursor of what surely awaits America? In traditional liberal fashion, when faced with adversity, blame coronavirus, or as Americans will soon learn, the COVID-19 pandemic is much less to blame for where our country and so many others across the world are present. What is more frightening is what happens next. How far and how deep is the ahead decline under today's Democrat Marxist movement led by President Biden? Across the United States, housing prices are at insane highs never seen in history. Food, gasoline, and other commodity prices are equally high, leaving Americans with less money in their pockets. But oddly, many don't believe that America is heading for a crash, but they should, and here's why. Today's member of the Liberal Party's solution to any problem is to spend their way out. Today, trillions of dollars have been spent on COVID-19 bailout relief, COVID-19 relief bailouts with more funding on the way. These payments have provided little to help families and massively pacified individuals from leaving their living rooms for employment lunchrooms. As a result, businesses big and small across the United States are short-staffed, leading to increased prices for products. But what is a liberal and actionable response? Well, naturally, to increase spending by paying Americans more and more to do nothing. Democrat Party-led federal and state government agencies have continued to extend eviction moratoriums, IRS child tax credit payments have commenced, and extended employment benefits paid to individuals who refuse to go back to work. And why? Because for Democrats, Americans are to be rewarded for mediocrity and receive assistance for just merely existing. It is this mentality that, under Biden, will bring all of America to its knees in less than a year. Despite Joe Biden's apparent lack of intelligence, the man achieved a $15 minimum wage mandate without passing legislation. By paying Americans more than what they previously earned employed to sit at home and do nothing, today's businesses are forced to pay entry-level and part-time workers $18 to $20 an hour while offering up to $1,000 sign-on bonuses. Seemingly overnight, a fast food worker could potentially earn $45,000 just to flip burgers. But you see, this increase in wages will now force companies to either follow suit with their competitors or close their doors. However, no matter what their result, business products are soon to skyrocket in price due to the forced increase in wages and shipping costs at an all-time high and American demand and spending out of control. Democrat Party initiatives are set to doom Americans of every demographic. We should all look to Cuba as a perfect illustration of what communism will do to a society. As Joe Biden and his fellow liberals attempt to engulf every American business and infrastructure aspect, what occurs when they fail? Let's be clear, the reason why our founding fathers debuted a strong centralized government is that they knew that big government couldn't sustain control over anything and should never be tasked with such. Our nation's founders clearly stated that the United States federal government's chief function was to provide national defense. Under Biden, it's also crumbling on a global scale as the U.S. ramps up efforts to depart our operations in Afghanistan and call it quits on the war on terror. No person can spend their way out of a problem. 1 Timothy 6:10 in the Bible reminds us that for the love of money is root of all evil, while some have coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Socialism will bring many sorrows. Looking at Cuba, Americans should remind themselves that due to our nation's big government, when the failure occurs, and it always does, we all pay the price. Unfortunately for America and all its citizens, the burden that Biden has placed on our country is something that we may never overcome. And that is so definitely very true there with that. I mean, we're seeing what's happening in Cuba right now, and, I think that it's going to remain, that the protests will remain. Everybody is basically upset down there, so, and we have probably a glimpse of what's going to happen in 2024 presidential election. This coming from my good friends over at Red State. On DeSantis providing leadership on Cuba while Joe Biden is missing in action by Nick Arama. Cuban Americans in Florida have been out in the streets rallying on behalf of their brethren in Cuba. They have been calling on Florida and the United States to help the Cuban people. Brian Tennant tweeted out, "The rain is not keeping crowds away from tonight's rally in Miami, telling Cuba's communist regime." While Joe Biden has said that he would stand with the Cuban people, it's not clear that he's actually doing anything at all to back up those words. Some folks in Cuba have tried to organize boats to go to Cuba and provide help, but the U.S. government was discouraging that. Meanwhile, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was striking all the right notes, meeting with Cuban American leaders in a roundtable discussion to discuss the deteriorating situation in Cuba. DeSantis also praised the Biden team for corrected the Biden team for falsely painting the protests in Cuba as a reaction to the pandemic. Governor DeSantis tweeted out, I had a good discussion with the leaders of the Cuban American community about the communist dictatorship's crimes against the people of Cuba. We stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba, and we are united in our support of their right to choose freedom over the communist regime. DeSantis also tweeted out, the people of Cuba are not protesting against COVID vaccines or shortages. They are demanding an end to the communist dictatorship that has imprisoned the island for more than 6 decades. Hashtag SOS Cuba. Governor DeSantis also uses perhaps the right word at this point, talking about why the people are revolting. The Cuban government blocked Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Telegram, and now they've cut off the internet altogether to make it harder to get information about what's happening in the country and to block Cubans from communicating with each other during protests. Reports also say that they cut off the phones. Many Cuban Americans are worried about their family members in Cuba amid the crackdown of their government and the bad conditions, and now no ability to communicate with them. DeSantis offered a potential solution from Fox News. What does the regime do when you start to see these images? They shut down the internet. They don't want the truth to be out. They don't want people to be able to communicate, DeSantis said during a roundtable discussion with Republican lawmakers and members of the Cuban exile community in Miami. And so one of the things I think we should be able to do with our private companies or with the United States is to provide some of that internet service via satellite. We have companies on the Space Coast that launch these things. He said he was going to make some calls and see what are the options from some Florida companies. Meanwhile, the Democrat response has been to attack DeSantis and suggest that his anti-riot law would forbid the Cuban-American protests in Miami. First, it shows that they don't care about the people in Cuba or the interests of the Cuban-American citizens here if they take that approach, but it also shows that they know nothing about the law they're talking about. If you aren't rioting and surrounding or attacking cars, then you have nothing to be concerned about. But Democrats seem to be more concerned about scoring one on DeSantis than they are about helping the Cuban and Cuban-American people, and that's not going to go over well in Florida. I think most Americans will remember this come 2024, and regardless of who is on the Republican ticket, whether it is DeSantis, or even if it is going to be former President Trump, I think that this will be one of the things that will cause the Biden-Harris ticket to be voted out of Washington, D.C. And speaking of former President Trump, we have this from a website called thefederalistpapers.org. Trump weighs in on Uprising, urges Biden to respect the protesters. I stand with the Cuban people 100%. Former President Donald Trump on Monday called for the Biden administration to show as much courage as Cubans protesting for freedom. I stand with the Cuban people 100% in their right for freedom. The government must let them speak and be free. Joe Biden must stand up to the communist regime, or history will remember, Trump said in a statement on his website. The Cuban people deserve freedom and human rights. They are not afraid. On Sunday, Cuba erupted in waves of protest, demanding an end to the nation's long-entrenched dictatorship as food has become scarce and COVID-19 is rampant, according to the Miami Herald. Some protesters chanted freedom and down with communism as they marched. Others called out down with the dictatorship and down with Diaz-Canel in reference to Cuban leader Miguel Diaz-Canel, who was anointed by Raul Castro to succeed him as the first non-Castro to rule the island since the 1959 revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power. We are not afraid, protesters Samantha Regalado chanted. Diaz-Canel said he does not plan to budge. We'll have to walk over our dead bodies if they want to take on the revolution, he said in a comment posted on the front page of the the Cuban Communist Party newspaper. According to the New York Times, we're willing to do everything and will be on the streets battling. During a Sunday speech, he said the protests were engineered by the U.S. to provoke a social uprising and justify an invasion. He called upon all revolutionaries to confront protesters with firmness and courage. We're not going to hand over the sovereignty or the independence of the people, he said. There are many revolutionaries in this country who are willing to give our lives. We are willing to do anything, and we will be on the streets fighting. Although U.S. President Joe Biden said the Cubans were seeking relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic, Cuban exiles said America needs to act and said the protests are about more than hunger and disease. The Cuban people are not on the streets asking for medicine. They're not on the streets asking for food. They're on the streets demanding freedom, said Orlando Gutierrez-Barnard of Miami, according to the Miami Herald. What they're saying is they don't want a tomorrow war with the Communist Party in charge. Trump in his statement noted that Biden, who was vice president during the Obama administration during its honeymoon period with the Castro government, has called for a closer American embrace of Cuba. Don't forget that Biden and the Democrats campaigned on reversing my very tough stance on Cuba. Remember when Obama attended baseball games with Castros while they imprisoned, beat, and killed the Cuban people, Trump said. Republican Senator Marco Rubio Florida said that 60 years of socialist dictatorship and oppression, as well as extraordinary courage from the Cuban people, have led to this moment, according to Fox News. Now more than ever, the Cuban people need our support as they fight for their freedom, Rubio said. The Cuban dictatorship has rejected every effort that would allow the Cuban people to prosper, including your previous efforts as vice president. Despite the Obama administration's efforts to engage with the regime, the dictatorship continues to restrict travel for political opponents, soften out the salaries of Cubans employed at foreign firms, and severely limit the economic freedom of its citizens to own property instead of business. The current protests in Cuba are not just about current economic shortages. They are about the long-standing and deliberate actions taken by the dictatorship to stymie the economic prosperity and political freedom of the Cuban people, Rubio wrote in a letter to Biden. I ask that given the events of the last day, that your administration issue a clear and unambiguous statement that the current U.S. policies toward the regime implemented by the Trump administration will remain in place. Like I've said a couple of times today, I do agree with Rubio on that. And it'll be interesting to see just what happens in Cuba. It's also going to be interesting to see what Biden's going to say about that as well. Leave a comment down below what you think about all this. Do you agree with Trump and do you agree with Trump, Rubio, and DeSantis? Do you agree with the Obama-Rhodes legacy? Do you think the Obama-Rhodes legacy is in shambles as Cubans march against communism? Leave a comment down below. I'll leave links to the articles in the show notes below, and I'll see you in the next video. With the uprisings in Cuba protesting the communist government, here are 6 things to watch for. This coming from my good friends over at the Daily Signal. 6 things to watch for during Cuba protests. This by Fred Lucas. The pro-freedom protests in Cuba are fluid, but the communist dictatorship there seems willing to soften its tone and allow travelers to bring in food and medicines amid the unrest. Still, though, mass arrests and detention of peaceful protesters continued. In the United States, Republicans called for the Biden administration to be more active in supporting protesters. However, the U.S. and other free nations mostly seem to be condemning the Cuban government's actions while waiting to see what happens next. Here are 6 things to watch for in Cuba. Number 1, movement by regime. Cuba's communist government, in a move seemingly designed to mollify protesters, announced Wednesday that it would lift restrictions on travelers bringing food, medicines, and hygiene products into the country. CNN reported, for the first time, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel made a concession about the regime's shortcomings after previously blaming the U.S. and social media for the unrest. USA Today reported. Diaz-Canel warned Sunday that protesters would face a strong response from the authorities, the Miami Herald reported. However, by Wednesday, Cuba's president used a slightly more conciliatory tone in a televised address, while still characterizing the protests as violence. We have to gain experience from the disturbances, Diaz-Canel said. We also have to carry out a critical analysis of our problems in order to act and overcome, and avoid their repetition. Number two, Cuban government's call to combat. Nevertheless, the United States is concerned about the crackdown on protesters that the Cuban government referred to as a call to combat, U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price said Tuesday. We remain deeply concerned by the Cuban government's call to combat and by the images of violence we've seen over the past 2 days, Price said. We call for calm and we condemn any violence against those who are protesting peacefully. We equally call on the Cuban government to release anyone detained for peaceful protest. More than 100 Cubans were detained or are missing in the protests that began Sunday, CNN reported. So far, only one death has been reported by the Cuban government, a 36-year-old woman, according to USA Today. Marco Rubio tweeted out, the regime in Cuba continues its violence against the Cuban people demanding Libertad. We are still receiving horrifying accounts from people inside the island, despite the cell phone and internet blockage. They are horrifying. Hashtag Cuba Libre. Hashtag SOS Cuba Libre. Cuban authorities also blocked internet access after the pro-freedom protests broke out across the Caribbean nation, where Fidel Castro and his forces seized power in a communist revolution in 1959. The United States, Canada, and the European Union criticized the arrest of political activists and journalists in recent days. We commend the people of Cuba for showing great bravery and strength of their will and their power of their voice, Price said. In response, the Cuban government has attempted to silence their voices and communications through internet shutdowns, violence, and arbitrary detentions of dozens of protesters, journalists, activists, and others. The protests began near the capital city of Havana, in a small town called San Antonio de los Baños, according to the New York Times. Protesters called for liberty and reform and also expressed frustration over food shortages, long a staple of the island nation's communist regime, as well as the unavailability of COVID-19 vaccines. As they marched on Havana and other cities throughout the country, protesters chanted, "We want freedom and we want vaccines." The unrest marks the first major protest in Cuba since 1994, largely because the government generally is able to suppress demonstrations. Number 3. U.S. warns Cubans not to flee here. In a swift departure from lax border policies in place since the Biden administration came into office January 20th, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas told Cubans and Haitians fleeing political violence not to bother coming to the United States. Allow me to be clear, if you take to the sea, you will not come to the United States, Mayorkas said. The move also marked a historic break from the past, as the U.S. traditionally has granted asylum to Cubans fleeing persecution since the 1959 revolution. The time is never right to attempt migration by sea, Mayorkas said. To those who risk their lives doing so, this risk is not worth taking. Do not risk your life attempting to enter the United States illegally. The Biden administration's response has come under criticism from other fronts. Talk show hosts and other pundits argue that Democrats assume that illegal immigrants from Mexico and Central America will vote for Democrats, but know that Cuban refugees tend to favor Republican policies. Number 4, Biden policy on Cuba. The Biden administration expressed support for the protesters, but has been reluctant to criticize Cuba's communist dictatorship. One reporter asked this question Wednesday of White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. Do you think that people are leaving Cuba because they don't like communism? Now, Psaki didn't give a straightforward response in answering that. Cuban citizens are upset with mismanagement by their government. I think we've been pretty clear that we think people are leaving Cuba or not leaving Cuba. We're protesting in the streets as well because they are opposed to the oppression, to the mismanagement of the government in the country, Psaki told reporters. and we certainly support their right to protest. We support their efforts to speak out against their treatment in Cuba. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida, said President Joe Biden should lead the international community in demanding freedom for the Cuban people. Rubio called on Biden to gather the Organization of American States and the United Nations to bring collective pressure on Cuba to cease repressive actions against its people. Marco Rubio tweeting out on Wednesday, after our meeting with White House yesterday, we wrote a follow-up to POTUS on 4 specific actions on Cuba, SOS Cuba Libre. Now, Rubio also faulted Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Emily Mandrala for a long history of calling for engagement with the Cuban regime. The State Department came out with a strong defense of Mandrala, Fox News reported Thursday. Deputy Assistant Secretary Mandrala has years of experience at the State Department, White House, and on Capitol Hill, working to support human rights and advance the cause of democracy in Cuba, the State Department statement said. The American and Cuban people are better off because of her continued public service. Number 5, U.S. and Internet access for Cubans. But now, at least, Cuban authorities have restored Internet access for Cubans, the Washington Post reported. Those with Internet access restored were able to see images of the communist government's crackdown on protesters, the Post noted. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, whose constituents include numerous Cuban Americans with family members still in that country, has called for the United States to provide Internet access to Cuban citizens who live fewer than 100 miles from his state. I write to urge you to assist in providing Internet access to the people of Cuba, standing up against communist oppression and demanding a voice after decades of suffering under the yoke of a cruel dictatorship, DeSantis, a Republican, wrote in a letter to Biden. Democrat Representative Val Demings of Florida tweeted about the Internet issue in Cuba. She said, last night we had a frank and open conversation with members of Central Florida's Cuban community. We discussed the urgent need to stand with the protesters in Cuba, ensure that the government can remain a lifeline to connect the Cuban people to their families in the U.S. U.S. provision of Internet access to Cubans is possible, DeSantis said, comparing the idea to U.S. broadcasts into communist countries during the Cold War to bypass state-run media. Technology exists to provide Internet access into Cuba remotely, using the innovation of American enterprise and the diverse industries here, DeSantis wrote Biden, adding, similar to the American efforts to broadcast radio into the Soviet Union during the Cold War in Europe, the federal government has a history of supporting the dissemination of information into Cuba for the Cuban people through radio and television Marti, located in Miami. In addition to sending information, however, our efforts must include creating a means for the Cuban people to speak to the world. The White House did not have a clear policy on this as of yet, Psaki told reporters. While the lack of Internet access, as you know, is a huge issue in Cuba and one that is very challenging for the people of Cuba, so they can gain access to accurate information, Psaki said. We're certainly looking at that to see what can be done to address the issue, but in terms of specific proposal, I don't have an assessment of that. Number 6, China blames U.S. On Tuesday, China's communist government essentially expressed support for Cuba's communist regime and blamed the United States for the protests. I had a little bit of liquid refreshment here. Anyway, back to the article. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said that the U.S. embargo is a root cause of Cuba's shortage of medicines and energy. Zhao said China firmly opposes foreign interference in Cuba's internal affairs, firmly supports what Cuba has done in fighting COVID-19, improving people's livelihood and upholding social stability, and firmly supports Cuba in exploring a development path suited to its national conditions. I would like to stress that China stands ready to work with Cuba to implement the important consensus of the two heads of state and is firmly committed to deepening friendly relations between the two countries. Speaking on Wednesday, former Vice President Mike Pence noted China's backing of its communist ally. This week's growing endorsement of the communist regime in Cuba, while brave Cubans are taking to the streets, demanding freedom, is a grim reminder of China's ongoing effort to gain a foothold in the Americas, Pence said in a speech at the Heritage Foundation. To be clear, China must never be allowed to build a military base in Latin America or anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. By the way, Pence is a distinguished visiting fellow at Heritage, the parent organization of the Daily Signal. And as if that were not enough, there is an article from PJ Media. Communism solved racism in Cuba, 1619 Project founder claimed, this by Tyler O'Neill. Brave freedom fighters in Cuba have taken to the streets demanding the end of the country's communist dictatorship. Just 2 years ago, however, Nicole Hannah-Jones, founder of the New York Times' 1619 Project, praised Cuba's communist revolution for bringing about the end of codified racism. Democrats like Joe Biden may offer lip service in support of the protesters, but many on the left have cheered on the oppression. In 2019, around the original launch of the 1619 Project, Hannah-Jones identified Cuba as a model for racial equality. The 1619 Project claims to unearth systemic racism in the United States, and the original version claimed that the true founding of America came not with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but with the arrival of the first slaves in Virginia in 1619. By the way, the first slaves actually arrived far earlier. In an interview with Vox's Ezra Klein, Hannah-Jones suggested the U.S. should follow Cuban fighting racism. Are there candidates right now, or even places, that you think have a viable and sufficiently ambitious integration agenda? And if so, what is it? Klein asked Hannah-Jones on this podcast, recently unearthed by the National Post. I am definitely not an expert on race relations internationally, Hannah-Jones began. She also admitted that it's also hard to look at countries that did not have large institutions of slavery and compare them to the United States. If you want to look at the most equal multiracial democracy, it's not a democracy. The most equal multiracial country in our hemisphere, it would be Cuba, Hannah-Jones said. She explicitly attributed the alleged racial inequality to socialism, the very oppressive system against which the protesters have arisen. Cuba has the least inequality among black and white people of any race really in the hemisphere. I mean, the Caribbean, well, most of the Caribbean. It's hard to count because the white population in a lot of these countries is very, very small. There are countries run by black folks, but in places that are truly at least biracial countries, Cuba actually has the least inequality, and that's largely due to socialism, which I'm sure no one wants to hear, Hannah-Jones argued. These remarks echoed Hannah-Jones's 2008 article published in The Oregonian. In that article, she disputes the official narrative that Cuba is poor, Cuba is communist, Cuba violates human rights, and represses dissent. Education is a cornerstone of the revolution, she wrote. She praised the communist country's education and healthcare systems, saying that the latter in particular is a world model. That Cubans especially are wary of outsiders wishing to overthrow the Castro regime. They admit the revolution has been imperfect, but it also led to the end of codified racism and brought universal education and access to jobs to black Cubans, she argued. Without the revolution, they wondered where would they be. Under the communist revolution, where are they now? They're in the streets fighting for freedom. Some of them have been arrested for speaking their minds. After all, unauthorized public gatherings are illegal in Cuba. It's funny how communism works that way. Communism also inspires revolution. In fact, Marx has cooked up critical race theory, CRT, which influences the 1619 Project, to encourage revolution by claiming that a hidden racism pervades American society. The 1619 Project reframes many aspects of American life as rooted in race-based slavery and oppression, including capitalism, the consumption of sugar, and America's rejection of 100% government-funded health care. The 1619 Project twists American history, and it appears to have inspired some of the destructive riots last year, Riots that destroyed black lives, black livelihoods, and black monuments. When Claremont's Charles Kessler wrote in the New York Post, called them the 1619 riots, Hannah Jones responded, in an old, by the way, since deleted tweet, that it would be an honor to claim responsibility for the destructive riots. Americans should learn from Cuba that Cubans are fighting for freedom against the regime Hannah Jones has repeatedly praised as a solution to the institutional racism she peddles. Cubans speak to the United States and they're now fighting for America's freedom. The U.S. cannot abandon that in the name of fighting racism. Yeah, I highly doubt that, this Nicole Hannah Jones seems like her elevator that does not go straight to the top. And, oh, by the way, speaking of Cubans being arrested, got this article from my friend at the Washington Free Bacon. Cuban police arrest regime critic during live interview. Cuban police arrested a YouTuber and critic of the communist regime at her home while she was interviewed by a Spanish news station. By the way, this article is by Philip Caldwell and it was written Tuesday. Dina Stars, a Cuban YouTube blogger who has documented this week's protest against the regime, was discussing the crisis Tuesday during a live remote panel hosted by a Spanish television program, Todo es Mentira. Halfway through the interview, Stars interjected in English, state security, or in Spanish, state security is outside, I have to go outside. Stars then left the room to speak to the police as the program's host reacted in disbelief. They're going to arrest her live on TV, one said. And there's a tweet there. Stars returned to the camera moments later to tell the panel that the Cuban authorities were taking her to the police headquarters. I will hold the government responsible for what may happen to me, Stars said. I have to go now. Video taken by one of Stars' friends showed Cuban police escort her out to the back of a police car before driving away. That is probably in the second tweet. Stars has been outspoken against the communist regime's crackdown on protests prior to her arrest, sharing on social media videos from demonstrations and a list of protesters who have disappeared or been arrested by Cuban security forces. The Cuban regime has clamped down on protests that have swept the country since Sunday. Demonstrators took to the streets in protest of the island nation's continued power outages, food shortages, and scarcity of vaccines, calling for an end to the 62-year-old communist regime. The government has responded by arresting dozens of protesters and restricting access to social media sites. And so yeah, that's just one of the many arrests that have been happening. And I mean, for it to be live on TV is something that's totally shocking. And there's this article from the Epoch Times. We talked about the 1619 Project founders saying that communism solved racism in Cuba. Well, there is this article from the Epoch Times that says Black Lives Matter blames deadly Cuban protests on U.S. government and defends the regime. Just by Lorenz Duchamp yesterday. Black Lives Matter is blaming the U.S. government's cruel and inhumane economic embargo for the current unrest in Cuba, while praising the communist regime for its solidarity by granting asylum to black revolutionaries. The Marxist organization has faced strong criticism since posting a statement on July 14 in response to protests that have erupted in multiple cities across Cuba, where demonstrators have called for greater freedoms and an end to leader Miguel Diaz-Canel's authoritarian regime. In the note that was posted to its social media profiles, the group condemned the 1962 U.S. embargo, claiming it was instituted with the explicit intention to destabilize Cuba and undermine the right of Cubans to choose their own government. Black Lives Matter condemns the U.S. federal government's inhumane treatment of Cubans and urges it to immediately lift the economic embargo, the group wrote. This cruel and inhumane policy, instituted with the explicit intention of destabilizing the country and undermining Cubans' right to choose their own government, is at the heart of Cuba's current crisis. The largest protest of the communist-controlled country has seen in decades erupted over the weekend after citizens rallied for freedom. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who rejected the claim that the United States is to blame for Cuba's unrest, said on July 12 that the main factor that led people to the streets lies with the mismanaged economy of the nation and the communist regime's failure to supply its citizens with basic needs. Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, among other officials, also rebuked the group of the claim. The extortionist ring, known as the Black Lives Matter organization, took a break today from shaking down corporations for millions and buying themselves mansions to share their support for the communist regime in Cuba, the Florida senator said on social media. Cuban leader Diaz-Canel said in a televised address on July 14, conceded that government shortcomings in handling shortages and other problems played a role in the protests, while also urging Cubans to not act with hate. Now, before his announcement, the Cuban regime had only blamed social media and the U.S. government for the protests, which were the biggest in Cuba since a quarter decade ago. The BLM statement, which was posted around the same time as Diaz-Canel commented about the revolt, was quickly disputed online, including by the group's own followers, urging them to take the post down. Very disappointing and uninformed statement, one person wrote. Another said BLM's view of Cuba's situation is a horrible misrepresentation of what's happening. In the note, BLM also praised the communist regime for its historically demonstrated solidarity with oppressed people of African descent and protecting black revolutionaries such as Assata Shakur, also known as Joanne Chesimard, a former member of the Black Liberation Army, who escaped from prison in 1979 while serving time for the execution style murder of a New Jersey state trooper. She was granted asylum by former Cuban leader Fidel Castro. She wrote, "Chas remains one of the FBI's most wanted terrorists." BLM, known for organizing protests against police brutality in the United States, didn't mention Cubans' calls for freedom against an oppressive regime and widespread reports of police brutality, sparking controversy. Disgusting. Despite the Cuban dictatorship's murdering and beating of protesters, many of them black, BLM's statement on Cuba condemns the U.S., but praises the Castro regime, and makes no mention of the atrocities being committed by the dictatorship, said Giancarlo Sopo, a communication strategist who once worked on President Donald Trump's re-election campaign. So there you have it. I mean, you look at it and you see that Black Lives Matter and the 1619 Project both support the communist regime in Cuba, all saying that communism basically solved racism in Cuba, and if anyone's to blame, it is the United States. However, you've also seen the Cuban police arrest a regime critic during a live interview. So leave a comment down below for what you think about all this. Do you support the protesters in Cuba? Do you support the Cuban regime? Do you think that the Cuban people should come to the United States or not? Leave a comment down below. I'm going to leave links to these articles in the show notes below, and I'll see you in the next video. And that's going to do it for the news for this week. I am Bulow. Again, if you like what you watched, please go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. Also subscribe, and tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell an enemy or two even. And I will be back next week. Until next time, peace.